All right, looks like we are live. It's almost 7:30 p.m. evening. Yes, it is 7:30 p.m. here in United
Okay.
States and morning 6 a.m. at your end, right, Shantanu? Let's get started.
Yes. Early morning 6 a.m. our time. All right. So, good morning to the people joining in from this part of the world. Good evening to the people joining in from Aniket's part of the world. And I don't think the people in the middle have woken up yet, but still,
Yeah,
wherever you are, happy to have you listen on to this. This is our 18th podcast in the podcast series. And again, very glad to have this opportunity to talk on some very pertinent topics for our listeners, for our small and medium business listeners. And again, uh, we did a couple of podcasts on this topic earlier, but it's such an important and such a pertinent topic for our listeners that we decided to continue this theme and delve deeper into this whole India EU FTA free trade agreement. So here we are again for another topic, another take on the whole development. So my name is Shantanu. I am the founder and principal consultant at 1.618 Business Consulting, and I have about 20 plus years of experience in strategy, marketing, strategy development, and deployment for both large MNCs as well as small and medium businesses. I've worked closely with clients in the industrial sector, in the B2C sector as well, and I feel that the small and medium businesses is the place where a lot of strategy, marketing fundamentals can be so effectively used. There's such a lot of potential for the SMBs to grow into large enterprises at some point. So I like working with them, coaching them, training them, and really developing some actionable strategies with them. So that's about me. I think Aniket, how
yeah.
about you?
Hello, all. Very good morning to the folks in India. I know it's really early start for you today, this week. And good evening to folks in United States or this part of west part of the world. Europe is, I think, pretty much in the midnight now. So, but yeah, thanks, Shantanu. Today's topic is very relevant. I mean, we did discuss this topic in earlier podcast, but we thought of having a deep dive because I think looking from a opportunity standpoint that opened up this year after India EU agreement trade agreement finalization. I think most of the SMBs might be wondering, okay, what do I need to do regarding this CBM um, CBM compliance? We thought of taking a deep dive and guiding you through what are the critical points that you have to think about, what could be missed. We have some case studies examples as well, so and also some framework. We always leave you with a framework. So I hope you all enjoy this podcast, and please get back to us if you have any uh, questions about it. This is my profile. I think, yeah, I've been talking about it. I have 15 plus years of experience in supply chain and warehouse automation. Worked in different industries, all the way from Fortune 500 companies, all the way from Cummins, automotive manufacturer, Amazon, and then now working in medical manufacturing consultancy company where I'm actually helping them to automate manufacturing automation line for pharma industry. So my experience has been all across from manufacturing to supply chain into the automation. I help businesses to solve the problems and optimize their solutions, leading to dollar savings. The impact is to their bottom line. The most proud thing that I've done, $9.8 million saving in Amazon. That project actually got yeah, globalize all across their distribution center. So I'm excited to share that learning and with whatever I have experience I have, and discuss all these issues or newer problems, as well as their solutions with you. So with that being said, enough of my talk, and let's dive into the topic. What do you think about this topic, Shantanu?
Yes, absolutely. I think let's start from the top for anyone who is still getting up to speed here. We spoke about this India EU free trade agreement, and the one thing that jumped out of the whole discussion in our last couple of topics is it's a great opportunity for Indian exporters, especially. But then it also comes with a lot of caveats and the fine print, the nuances of that, and that needs to be looked into. Right? We have on one hand, we have the tariffs coming down by almost 96% of
Yeah,
the EU goods, for the EU goods coming to India. But then the critical part is that there are some exemptions or some compliances rather that have no exemptions, especially the carbon border tax adjustment mechanism, the levy or the tax, the tariffs that are going to be levied on the assessment of your carbon footprint for every product that's going to get into EU from India. So the European Commission has confirmed that they're not going to be lenient on that. Uh, India explicitly doesn't get any special treatment on it. So on one hand, you have this FTA that opens doors, but then also the CBAM, which is adding cost to the exports that you're going to do. So it's a milieu of opportunities, as well as, I would say, not challenges really, but some things that pitfalls or landmines that the companies would need to watch out for while treading this path, right? So, uh, CBAM is essentially Europe's way of saying that if you want to sell carbon intensive goods in our market, you need to pay for the carbon embedded in those goods. Just like European producers already pay under the EU emissions trading system, the ETS. So from 2026, starting now, EU importers must purchase and surrender CBAM certificates that match the emissions in what they are importing. So that's something that the Indian exporters also need to watch out for. So we'll be talking specifically on the CBAM topic today, right?
yeah, that's exactly right. Like EU ETS carbon price right now, right? Most of you will be wondering about 81 euros per ton of carbon dioxide as of early February 2026. That's the projected figure, and then the projections from multiple analysts have it averaging around 85 euros for this year. So potentially crossing 100 euros by 2027. So consensus puts it around 126 euros by 2030. So just this is not going to get cheaper. So the cost trajectory is emphatically upward. So how do we prepare our SMBs for that? That's the question that we will be
Yeah.
unpacking today.
Yeah, and that's what we want to clearly lay out. The CBAM cost burden, as you can see on the slide here, for Indian exporters is estimated at 1.5 to 2 billion in 2026, and that's going to grow to almost 3 to 4 billion by 2034. So it's a massive jump in that, massive cost that can directly hit your bottom line, directly hit your PNL. And the FTA doesn't offer a waiver in this case, right? The we had the EU's chief spokesperson recently say very directly that there is no commitment to change CBAM obligations or grant India any more favorable treatment on that particular topic. Right? So
Yeah,
it's a must do for SMBs now.
yeah, and 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 on this framing, right? I just want, I have a little bit different thought. So
Mm,
I think some of our listeners might hear 1.5 million, for $1.5 billion and think, well, that's spread across all sectors. Maybe my small operation is not really affected. They might think in
mm,
that direction, right? But let's look at the sector breakdown. India was the EU's number one supplier of iron and steel in 2024, around 3.9 billion euros in imports. Steel
mm,
exports to EU already dropped 31% in the first 8 months of 2025 just from CBM uncertainty. Just let that sink in. 31% drop first 8 months of 2025, and steel accounts for almost about 90% of India's CBM exports to EU. So if you are a
mm.
steel SMB, this is not abstract, it's existential. So just let that sink in and think about that.
Yeah, so I think there is pun intended in this. If you're a steel SMB and if you're a still SMB, you are in some issue, right?
Good
If
point.
you're still not moving, you should be worried as well. But I think that's what our theme has been of doing this podcast series, and also the way we look at this is it actually presents itself as a as a growth opportunity, as a differentiator, right? It We want to reframe this whole conversation. So although it might seem that CBAM is a trade barrier, it's actually something that rewards transparency. It rewards, if you're data rich, low carbon producer, with, then it presents you with a genuine competitive advantage, right? Because it's not easy to do. We understand that, but it's easy or it's doable if you start now, and if you think about it in an organized fashion, and take actions, relevant actions consistently, then the companies actually can prove that their actual emissions are lower than default values, for example, and they will pay less of this tax. They will win more contracts. They will put on a better competitive advantage and gain market share. Right? So that's really the opportunity that's hiding inside this apparent threat, and that's what we want to bring out through these conversations and through these takes on it.
Absolutely, and that framing matters, right? The Global Trade Initiative, um, GTR, that actually estimates Indian exporters may need to cut prices by 15 to 20% to absorb the CBM tax burden, and if they don't have a verified low carbon data. So 15 to 22% of your margins just because you couldn't prove your actual emissions. So that's the data penalty our playbook talks about. A 3x cost penalty for relying on EU default values instead of verified actuals. So let's look at
Mm.
next slide and then we can dive in into. Let's go sector by sector.
Yeah. Uh, I see the framework slide. You could probably bring up the sectoral slide.
Oh yeah, yeah. There you go.
That's okay. So we already spoke about steel. Understandably, agreeably, steel is one of the biggest sectors that are going to get impacted, or one of the sectors that's going to get impacted the most, if I can put it that way. But it varies a lot across different sectors. Like for steel, particularly, we are looking at about 15 to 20% initial cost increase.
Yeah,
I think it goes from 56 euros to 80 euros per ton of steel exported. That's, I think, a 50, almost a 55% cost increase by
cost increase. Yeah.
2034. Yeah, as free allocations that were in existence so far, they phase out gradually, or maybe eventually completely phase out.
Yeah, and talking about the structural problem, Indian steel has an average emission intensity of about 2.5 tons of carbon dioxide per ton of steel. Just 2.5 tons of carbon dioxide per ton of steel. So the EU benchmark is around 1.5 to 1.8. So right off the gate, Indian steel is roughly 50% more carbon intensive than European steel. Okay, so Indian steel sector accounts for almost about 12% of national emissions, well above the global average of 8%. So about half of the India's production comes from smaller, unregulated facilities, heavily dependent on coal, and our ore quality is lower grade, which requires more energy to process. There are some structural issues, not quick fixes. So that's something that they need to think about. There are some alternate sources that you can uh, source this higher grade carbon ore, iron
Mm.
core actually, to offset that we will discuss later on. But just keep this in mind, these numbers, these stats are very very important for you to
Yeah,
uh, keep things in perspective.
yeah, absolutely. And I think if you see here, aluminum is also similarly exposed. 12 to 22% of export value that gets hit immediately. Cement also faces 15 to 30% cost increase. Um, Fertilizer sector here, if you see 120 euros to 240 euros per ton of additional cost. So really on that whole, it's a broad spectrum depending on how you're generating your power and how how your equipment are, taking into consideration all those things to calculate your carbon footprint. You could face a massive 240 euro cost per ton of whatever product you are exporting. And the 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 crux here is that a lot of people miss this is the default value penalties also escalate, right? So
Mhm.
eh, in 2026, let's say for example, you can't provide verified data, or the you are not able to justify or showcase your actual carbon credits there or carbon footprint there, then you adds a 10% markup to the default, and by 2027 that's going to be 20%, and then from 2028 onwards, as you can see here, it's going to be 30%. So not only your absolute costs are going to increase per ton, but then the levies on top of that are also as a percentage going to increase. So I think the bottom line here is procrastination for you is going to cost you dearly. And it's only going to increase every year.
Yeah, exactly. And then I want to add some context that goes beyond our slides. The competitive picture is getting worse, not better. China is moving faster than India, as some of you already know, on CBM readiness. China National Nuclear Corporation has already deployed a new carbon dioxide based heat transfer technology in a steel plant in Guizhou. So Chinese producers, they are building low carbon power infrastructure for entire industrial clusters, specifically meet CBM requirements. So if your competitor, Chinese competitor, is comply faster, it puts pressure on you as an Indian exporter, uh, just because you lose that relative competitiveness if nothing is changes. So keep that in
Yeah,
mind.
yeah. I think that's an interesting point, Aniket, because it's game theory, right? At the end of the day,
Yeah.
you can't. This is not happening in isolation. Just because EU and India signed this trade deal doesn't mean that the world's going to sit down and watch the two laugh to the bank. So there's going to be increased competition from other regions, other countries, other economies, to of course safeguard their interests, and they're going to play a role in how actually this whole thing pans out, because it's not just China. You mentioned one example, but then there's Turkey, there's South Korea, there's Vietnam. They are all major EU suppliers, and we are talking about steel in particular here, or these specific sectors. Um, the countries that I mentioned, they are all major steel suppliers to the EU. So, compared to our Indian exporters, let's say, if exporters from these countries, they get their emissions data and verifications sorted out before we do from here, then we are at a competitive disadvantage, right?
100%.
Our exporters are just going to get priced out, and it's really a race at the end of the day. And the, as they say, the gun has already fired, so you have to be off your blocks now.
Yeah, and look, I also want to give a realistic assessment also here, right? Look at India's CBM expose exports to the EU. It only represent 0.2% of GDP. So the CSAP study projects potential GDP impact of around 0.02 to 0.03% under a pure CBM scenario. So
Mhm.
macroeconomically, I think India will be fine. But for a specific SMBs in this sector, like we talked about aluminum, steel, cement, and fertilizers, they
Mhm.
for the 25,000 to 30,000 MSMEs exporting to Europe, this is going to be a make or break issue for them, right?
Mhm.
Because the aggregate numbers, they really hide the concentrated pain. So overall, for the Indian economy, we might be okay. But if those SMEs who have invested a lot of their capital into this and they are exploring this Europe opportunities, CBM is
Yeah.
going to be a big point. That's why they need to be really prepared for this challenge.
Yeah. And someone might think that there could be a backdoor entry to the backdoor exit to this, and there could be some loopholes or some ways to avoid this. But I think now people have become smarter. So the EU's own assessment, it says that the allowance in the supply is going to absolutely go down. In 2026, it will be lower by about 8% as compared to 2025. And then in 2027, I think it's going to be lower than 5% or lower by 5% compared to 26. And then by 2034, that allowance is going to go to zero, right? So there's going to be this massive structural tightening as well. I think they have pre-thought all of this and really taking actions to make it very tight, make it very specific, and it only means that the cost is going to rise every single year from here on, and there's no mechanism to reverse that. There are no backdoor exits. There are no loopholes in this.
Correct. Correct. There's no mechanism to reverse that too, right? So I would also flag the UK dimension. So Britain is implementing its own carbon border adjustment this year. So if you are an Indian SMB thinking, fine, okay, I'll just shift to the UK instead of EU, that escape route is also closing. So Russia has already filed a WTO dispute against CBM, joined by other developing nations. So the UNCTAD, right, has warned about worsening trade inequalities. So there will be these legal and domestic battles will take years to settle down, but I think there are some financial obligations that will be due now. So keep thinking about that.
Mm. Yeah. And from the exporter's perspective, there's also this mentality that needs to be taken into account. That's an important behavioral angle here. An SMB exporter from India, from any of the industrial clusters here, they are running their operations on a very thin margin, right? And when they hear carbon border adjustment mechanism, it sounds like another uh, bureaucratic or policy framework that doesn't really impact them. It's for the big politicians and the big bosses in Brussels, the EU Commission, or in New Delhi to think about. So for them, it's remote and it's abstract. But when you tell them that the EU customer will literally pay less per ton by sourcing from a competitor who has better emissions data and not from you, then that's what hits home more for them, right? That's the language that every business owner is going to understand. So this is actually, it all boils down to winning and losing contracts or winning and losing orders. It's as simple as that.
Yep, agree. And let's move on to the next slide now. Compliance gap.
Right. So I think this is an uncomfortable truth that everyone has to face, really. And I, I do think at this point, Indian exporters are unprepared for this in a way. You know, there are we have what as we show here, there are four critical gaps in the understanding or in the clarity that Indian exporters need to develop, and each one is really a structural challenge. So we can go through the gaps quickly here.
Yeah. So the gap number one, if you look at this map, it's emission measurement gap. So India's continuous emission monitoring system (CMES) that was designed to track pollutants like SO2, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter, but
Mhm.
not carbon dioxide specifically. So we have no indigenous certification framework for carbon measurement at the product level that meets EU CBAM methodology standards. Most Indian facilities simply don't measure what CBM requires them to them to
Okay.
report. Actually. Yeah,
Right. Yeah, so that's on the emissions part. Then on the verification aspect too, there's a bottleneck here. CBAM requires third-party verification from EU accredited bodies.
yeah,
So we are talking about organizations like the SGS or TUV, Bureau Veritas. Uh, they would only accept certifications coming from such organizations or such agencies that are EU accredited. And the problem there is their capacity uh, to analyze and test and certify companies in India is going to be severely limited. There's obviously going to be a lot of demand, a big surge of Indian companies who would be going in for these certifications and testings. But I don't think these companies are going to invest in their capabilities exponentially or proportionately to the demand. So, if you talk numbers, you have about 25, 30,000 MSME exporters who potentially need these verification
verification
services.
services. Yeah,
And there are only a handful of these accredited bodies available in India. So if you don't, book a verifier now, you may not get one when you need it for almost months together. So that's the practical challenge that SMEs will face.
yeah, you're right. And then there is a research, CEW's research that back this up. There are industry respondents in their study called 2026, a very hard deadline, and then
Mhm.
specifically flagged that Indian industries lack the capacity for product level emissions calculation that meets EU standards. So they recommended that government develop emissions factor. There are some databases associated with that companies can reference as of today. Right, those databases don't exist at the required granularity as of now.
Okay. Yeah.
So that is
Yeah.
a gap.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a practical gap. People will have to think uh, much earlier into the whole cycle about such things. Now, the third gap here that we see is the carbon intensity gap itself. Now, we mentioned the numbers in the earlier slide when we looked at the sectoral details. Indian steel at, I think it was 2.5 tons CO2 per ton versus EU steel, which is 1.5 to 1.8. Right? So there's already lower CO2 per ton for the EU scheme. And the stat that we do want to highlight is Indian exports have 12.5 times higher carbon intensity per dollar of exports
100%.
compared
Yeah,
to EU producers. Right? So it's not a small gap. It's a chasm. It's a valley between the two. The carbon intensity per ton when you look at it that as a statistic.
absolutely. And the last one, gap four, is the one I think more strategically significant. That's a
Mm,
carbon price gap. So look at the carbon credit trading scheme that prices carbon at roughly $10 per ton. The EU ETS is at 81 euros per ton. That's a 78 per ton gap where Indian
mm,
exporters get no deduction. So if you look at from a CBM standpoint, under CBM, if your home country has a recognized carbon price, you can deduct
mm,
what you already paid. So the but Indian system is not currently recognized by the EU. So Indian firms are
mm,
paying twice the money, once domestically and then full CBM
mhm.
rate on exports.
I think it's a real challenge, and we recently saw the Steel Ministry Secretary, Mr. Sandeep Pondrik. He also mentioned that the government recognizes that this is going to be a burden on the exporters. Even with the FTA, the exports to the EU will remain a challenge because of this particular specific topic of CBAM. Right? So they are considering, I think, various ways to incentivize the exporters and offset the CBAM costs and CBAM impacts, but they haven't clearly mentioned what it is going to be, right? And
Correct.
whatever framework, incentive framework or subsidy framework that they are going to come up with, I think it has to be uh, clearly calibrated and carefully calibrated to avoid violating any WTO anti-subsidy provisions as well. Right? So there's not much room to just give out a subsidy or give out an incentive to reduce this cost. It has also to fall in that World Trade Organization framework of subsidizing exports. So there is movement on the policy level as well, but then for SMBs, you can't wait for that to happen. You can't wait
100%.
for the government to come up with some solution and then you think of reacting to that. That's not how it is going to be. You will have to act now. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, right. And Finance Minister Sitaraman also called CBM as an unilateral and arbitrary. From a trade equity
Mm,
standpoint, that's a valid argument there. There is a valid argument there. But whether or not India's diplomatic protest succeed, the CBM certificates are being surrendered starting in 2026. So the first
mm.
financial settlement deadline is September 30, 2027 for 2026 imports. So the geopolitical debate does not pause the compliance clock. Just keep in that mind.
Yeah, yeah. And then I think there's one thing that we would like our listeners to also understand is this FTA is actually opening the door here because there's now a commitment to launch a joint India EU climate action platform in this first half of 2026. And about 500 million euros or 600 million dollars in other words in EU support is expected in over the next 2 years for India's greenhouse gas mitigation efforts. So there are some uh, incentive frameworks coming to picture. There's also a possibility for a technical dialogue on CBAM specifically. So while there's no exemption, there are ways and means that government or semi-government organizations are working to make sure that while there is no exemption, there is a channel for India to influence how CBAM is implemented and potentially get support for building the infrastructure we need. So while there is not going to be any exemption on it, there are going to be there are efforts being put in order to make sure that Indian exporters get there early and get there easily in order to make sure that their exports meet the compliances.
Yeah, and good that you talk about this. Shantanu. It's an important nuance, but I would caution against reading too much into it because the technical dialogue generally is not operational relief because
Mm,
there's 500 million euros is envisaged and that's not committed. So it's a spread across all of India's climate efforts. It's not earmarked for CBM readiness specifically.
mm,
So SMBs they cannot build their business plans around Brussels softening their stance or build your what we would suggest you is build your plan assuming full CBM enforcement, and if relief comes, treat it as an upside, but be prepared for the worst.
yeah, absolutely. I think that brings us to our important, meat of what we're doing. The carbon smart framework. I think the slide before
Oh
the
yeah, sorry.
sectoral one. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, give me a second. Yep, let's talk
Yeah.
about this.
Right. So we spoke about the problem. We spoke about the pitfalls. Now let's talk about how we can avoid them, how we can overcome them, and that's where our carbon or CARBON smart framework comes in. Right? We designed this as a six pillar model here,
Yeah,
uh, sort of a mental model for SMBs to really grasp the whole thing and come up with solutions which could be amongst one of these pillars. Let's walk through each of them one by one. Aniket. Yeah.
yeah, let's go for it. Yeah, I'll add the operational reality check on each one because I know
Right.
our listeners want to know what this actually looks like on the shop floor. Right?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So the first one, if we start at the top left, carbon, out of carbon, the first C is comply. So that's specifically on about data and verification. This is where it should all start. You need facility level emissions measurement using the standard GHG measurement protocols, scope 1 direct emissions, scope 2 indirect emissions from your power consumption or electricity. You need that data to be verified from an accredited body, and without this, your EU importer will fall back on default values. And
Yep,
as we discussed, that's I think 3x the cost penalty, to put it simply.
absolutely. And operationally, what does this mean for a mid-sized steel fabricator in Maharashtra or Gujarat? It means you need to move beyond spreadsheet tracking because I know most of them use this spreadsheets and try to track it, but you need to continuous monitoring of energy inputs, fuel consumption, and process emissions at the product line level, not at the just the facility level. You need to capture the product line level as well. That will give you a more thorough and in-depth capturing of carbon credits. And then CBM cares about embedded emissions in specific products tied to specific CN codes. So if you are making multiple products, you need allocation methodologies that can withstand verification scrutiny.
Mhm. Absolutely. All right, so let's move to the next one. That's Abate. Um, you see that on the top right here. That's about energy and process decarbonization, and that is about actually reducing the emissions in your processes and how you consume energy for production. Because every ton of CO2 you eliminate is a ton of CBAM certificate that your importer that doesn't have to buy. right?
Yep.
So it's a lower cost for you. Now, switching to renewables can cut emissions by 20 to 40% in many cases. Renewable PPAs, you could adopt electric arc furnaces. We spoke about this in our last podcast. What can you do on the source of energy? What can you do on the equipment part of it? So for steel, anyone, or you could take up energy efficient upgrades to your equipment and earn these credits.
Agree. So one should note that the electric arc furnace currently represent only about 13% of India's steel production capacity. The global average is around 29%, I believe. Uh, yeah, but US and EU extensively use arc furnaces, electric arc furnaces, which is
Hmm.
partly why their steel is less carbon intensive. But for Indian SMBs, the capital cost of transitioning is very, very significant. Uh, but
Hmm.
but the CBM saving create a new line item in your capex business case that
Hmm.
did not exist before 2026. So just you need to keep that in mind.
No, absolutely, and that's exactly what I think SMBs or listeners would want to hear or would want to understand. This is direct P&L impact, right? This is direct balance sheet impact as well. So very important point here. Then pillar three here is redirect. That's redirecting your market and product strategy or portfolio strategy. Not all products and not all customers are going to be equally exposed to this whole paradigm. So you need to segment your product portfolio according to how much CBAM exposure they are going to have. Like maybe your high carbon products get redirected to non-EU markets. You could be looking at Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, for that matter, and your lower intensity variants go to Europe actually. So you need to look at the entire portfolio spread, segment it according to this additional, I would say, additional test in a way, and or an additional factor, and then decide where you position which product in terms of the regions, right? So think about it as a portfolio strategy, not just one size fits all approach.
Yeah, a very good point. That's smart in theory, right? But here's a caveat. Like, I want to challenge that assumption that non-EU markets are a safe haven forever.
Hmm.
The UK is implementing its own carbon border adjustment this year. Canada, Australia, Japan, they are all studying similar mechanism. So you never know, even they can switch to that. CBM is a first mover, not a one-off. So EU itself plans to expand CBM to downstream products like chemicals by 2030,
Hmm.
right? So redirecting might buy you some time, but it's not a permanent strategy. And that's
Yeah,
where,
that's true. I think yeah, that's a fair point because of course you can't be treating these other markets as, in a way, dumping grounds for your non-compliant products. So
it's an
it
interim
might be a
strategy,
short-term.
not a long term. Yeah.
It's a short-term strategy to sort of manage your stockpiles, so manage your inventory as of today. But then this is going to be, I think, all pervasive. All regions, all economies are going to think about this, and you just need to be prepared to be really honestly low carbon intensive and not just for the EU in this case. That's
Yeah.
right.
And that also buys
So,
get you a competitive advantage in long term.
correct.
So
Yeah. The earlier you do that. All right. So the fourth pillar here is the build pillar. Again, building capabilities and green credentials. This is about proactively building the carbon literacy and getting your green brand as it's been a buzzword, but now it's necessary. You will have to go for that, get certified, train your team, build relationships with EU accredited verifiers. We spoke about a few of those agencies earlier, and develop your monitoring, reporting, verification framework, or that process. We call it MRV for short, monitoring, reporting, verification. So uh, make that as your core competency,
100.
those capabilities as your core competency, not as a reactive measure or not as an afterthought.
Very well said. Yeah. The fifth pillar is O for optimize efficiencies and circularity. So as you circular economy practices like scrap utilization, wasted recovery, material efficiencies, things like that. These all reduce your embedded emissions and your
Mm.
cost simultaneously. So it's the classic operational excellence play, um, except now there is a direct external financial incentive tied to the carbon pricing.
Right. Okay, and then the last one here is navigate. Navigate your risks and contracts. I think this is about protecting yourself commercially. You can renegotiate your EU supply contracts to include CBAM cost sharing provisions. You can build in carbon price escalation clauses into your contracts. You just need to make sure that you're not absorbing the entire cost on your margins. So your EU importers have to buy certificates. You need to work with them on how that cost gets shared between the two of you, right? You as an exporter and then your EU counterpart who is going to import that. So start negotiating, start discussing with them about how this is going to pan out, who's going to take on what share of the cost. I think that's going
Correct.
to be important too.
And that is where I think a lot of SMEs misses the point, because the CBM compliance is not just your problem; it's your EU importers' problem too. Think about, they are, because they are the one buying the certificate. They need your accurate emission data to minimize their cost too. So that gives you a leverage, because the
Mm.
exporters who share data proactively and invest in verification, they are the ones EU importers will prefer all the time, because they're working with you becomes a, it's cheaper for them also. Do not have to um, deal with the hassles uh,
Yeah,
all along.
yeah,
If you build a good trusting relationship with them, it's better for you and better for your business.
yeah. And we have been talking about the practical operational stuff. I think in on this point, uh, the single most underappreciated thing in this whole conversation is that it's really all boils down to, on one hand, if you, let's say, so there are two suppliers to the EU importer, and they are quoting a very similar price for the same product. The supplier with a lower verified carbon footprint is going to win. That's the bottom line. There are not going to be any further discussions on that. I think the CBAM has made uh, carbon performance a procurement variable. So it's
Yeah,
now a factor in deciding in decision making.
100%.
It it is almost as equally important as price and quality and delivery time. Typically, the things that any sourcing manager or sourcing lead would think about. But that's a fundamental shift in how EU buyers are going to evaluate suppliers, and Indian SMBs need to really be prepared for that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and let me give you the practical version. So, if you're an aluminum exporter to in Kerala, right, your EU customer is comparing you against a Turkish supplier. So you're both offering a similar product at similar price, but the Turkish supplier might say, "Hey, oh, he has verified emissions data showing 8 tons of carbon dioxide per ton of aluminum, and you are using default values that the EU assigns at, say, 12 tons. The customer CBM bill of for buying from you is 50% higher from Turkey, right? So if your even if your actual emissions are the same or lower without the verified data to prove it, you lose. So the data gap is what kills you, not necessarily the carbon emission gap.
Right, absolutely. And that's why I think we put the the comply part as the first step in this whole framework. If you see, it's not just there, because it comes alphabetically first in this case. It's there because it's first in priority. Without data, you're not going to be able to achieve any of this. Nothing else in this whole framework will matter if you don't have your emissions data done well.
Correct. All right, moving on to the action plan. Let's talk about the action plan. Uh,
Yes, yeah, the one, I think the one before that. This one.
yeah.
Correct. So here we have tried to lay out what you can do about this. This playbook lays it out over three time horizons and a specific 30, 60, 90-day plan, which we'll talk about after this. But this is really short term, mid term, long term kind of a view that you can take on your actions. Short term, in the next 18 months, that's really the survival mode. It's a it's something that has you'll have to face anew because of all these changes that are happening in policy. um, so it's going to be more survival mode for the next 18 months or so. Midterm, we have taken a 18 to 48 months view up to 4 years view, which is going to be all about cost competitive compliances. And then long term, it's 4 to 10 years, it's going to be premium positioning, so positioning yourselves at the leading edge of being the green exporter to the EU. So think we can think about this over this time horizon, but then the actions, and as I said, we'll come to that, need to be taken now and in the next 90 days. So there will be a clear plan that we will leave you with about that too.
Yeah. Yeah, and starting with the 30-day sprint, like days 1 through 30, you do four things. First one is appoint a CBM compliance officer, make someone full-time responsibility. Second one is the map every EU bound product by its CN code. That's a combined nomenclature code that determines whether your product falls under the CBM scope or not. The third thing is confirm your EU importers authorize CBM declarant status. Basically, that's like you're confirming whether does your code lines up with the CBM status or not. And then the deadline for that was I think March 31st. So you still have time,
Mm,
um, 2026. And the fourth
mm.
one is the engage and accredited verifier. Uh, we mentioned some name earlier, but book them now, not next quarter. I would say have an urgent action on that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And Aniket, if we can switch to the last slide, I think that's where we have laid it out more clearly about the 30, 60, 90 plan,
Yeah.
so that the actions become more clear, right? Yeah. So you mentioned the first 30 days actions that you can take
Uh,
immediately. I think the next one, the 31 to 60, that's the time frame when you can go deeper onto what you lay out as your framework in the first 30 days. You can conduct a full carbon audit, a full carbon footprint audit on your operations, on your energy consumption and other areas, scope 1, scope 2 emissions, etc. You could install a digital MRV, sort of a framework. That's the monitor, report, verify framework. You could use IoT sensors for doing that, for continuous monitoring. Now, this is critical for producing the kind of data that EU verification requires. You could actually model your actual CBAM financial exposure under three ETS pricing scenarios. Those 60 euros, 85 euros, 120 euros per ton. So depending on where you fall with your emissions data, you could use these cost points and model them into your PNL. And then you execute your energy efficiency with quick wins. You could be, as you know, we've been talking about using renewable energy. You could look at your lighting. You could look at your how you're using compressed air, steam systems, waste generation and waste management, so heat treatment. So all these energy heavy processes in your entire manufacturing process, those are the lower hanging fruits that reduce both
100%.
your energy bill as well as your carbon footprint. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, just in the interest of time, I'm just watching the clock. I think this slide is very clear. We'll share this with the SMBs. How about we go to that? This we'll spend time on this slide. Give me a second. The winners and losers, because that is also like one some case studies that we studied. We'll just cover that and then we can go to the summary and then is that okay?
Alright.
The call to action.
Yeah, yeah, that works. That works. Yeah, I think with the with the carbon framework and the 30, 60, 90-day plan, I think there's pretty much a lot of practical to-do things that we are leaving the
Correct.
listeners with. And with this, I think these two examples are very important as well. Contrasting case studies here.
Mm-hmm.
On one side, you have the winner who has done it well. We took an example of Bharat SteelTech. They mapped their EU exposure early and invested in the technology to to earn those renewable PPAs. They built their MRV framework as well, and with third-party verification and co-designed low carbon steel products
Products. Yeah.
for the EU OEMs, they could achieve a fantastic result here. They retained and expanded their EU volumes at better margins, and they gained 15% additional
Oh,
market share. Yeah.
that's staggering. Yeah, and the warning is the Shakti Metals and Cement. I think we did discuss this case study last time also, but just want to deep dive in again here. They treated CBM as a process noise and ignored that emission data. Continued the coal heavy operations without verifications. So when CBM hit, the EU importers applied default values to their products, massively inflating the cost, and then they lost the tenders to competitors, lost the business. Their EU order book shrank sharply, and they got permanently locked out of the supply chain.
Yeah, I think that's something that everyone needs to watch out for, because if you're locked out permanently out of this whole market, uh, it's going to be catastrophic, right? Now CVAM isn't a one-time cost you absorb, so it's going to be a structural shift into how the whole EU procurement is going to work. So if the EU, let's say an automobile manufacturer, builds its supply chain around verified low carbon steel suppliers, they are not going to requalify you to 2 years later because you finally got your act together. There are enough suppliers out there in the market who are going to take your place. Right? So once you are losing it, you're going to lose it almost forever.
Correct.
Those
And
relationships are going to get locked in. Yeah.
exactly. And think of this way, like, supply chain management, we talk about qualification and requalification cost. So when an EU OEM qualifies you for a low carbon Indian supplier as a strategic partner, the switching cost for them is gonna go higher because
Hmm.
if they switch to the high carbon supplier, the cost is enormous. They would have to redeclare, buy more certificates, potentially face scrutiny from their own sustainability commitments. So the early movers in this sector get a durable competitive moat. If you are the first
Yeah.
one to qualify and get their trust and get the certificates, the switching cost for them is higher. You'll get a durable advantage to sticking with them and then be a continuous supplier.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, to
Yeah.
these EU partners. Yeah.
Right. I think in this case, we also have one more example that we haven't put out here, but we want to share is
Mhm.
the Apollo tires example.
Yeah.
The APL Apollo tire, Apollo tubes in India. They have committed to reaching, I think, roughly 80% of renewable electricity capacity at some of their facilities, which gives them amongst the lowest CBAM cost exposure of any Indian steel exporter. Right? And that's what proactive adoption that we have been talking about. That's what it looks like. It's already translating into a competitive advantage for them.
That's absolutely, yeah. And the other side, consider those numbers from India's actual trade data. So in the first half of fiscal year 2025-6, April to September, and the steel imports from India hit a 4.43 million tons, up 40% year-on-year basis. So that
Mm.
supply specifically to the EU surged 69% in that period to 2.1 million tons. So a lot of that surge actually was actually EU buyers restocking ahead of CBM enforcement. So essentially front loading the purchases before the financial obligations kicked in, and that
Kicked in.
restocking wave is now over. Mind you that. Okay. So the
Mm.
question is what happens, what every ton going forward carries a real carbon cost.
Yeah, hey, restocking again. It's one of those adjustments that you do.
It's a
It's
one-time
it's
effect.
not
Yeah.
a strategy. It's a one timer. It's a one time effect. And post these things kick in post January 26, 1st January 2026. Every shipment is going to be then priced differently. The
100%.
firms that were being bought from during the restocking rush are the same ones that need to prove that their emissions are now lower compared to what they were earlier. So if they can't do that, then their volumes are going to collapse. They can't expect that the restocking volumes will continue going forward because these things have now kicked in. So if they can and they have locked in their relationships at a moment of this shift happening, then they are in a good stead. The timing in this case will matter the most.
100%. All right, before we close, Shantanu, let's quickly address some few questions we are getting from community. Like first question, you want to cover that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we looked at those questions. One question that we constantly get is, will India's domestic carbon price give us any offset? So the short answer is not yet. India's carbon credit trading scheme would need EU recognition as an
Mm,
equivalent carbon pricing instrument. That doesn't exist today. The CACP study that Aniket mentioned earlier, it recommends that India implement a moderate carbon tax specifically to retain revenue domestically, rather than exporters exporting that to the EU via CBAM. But till that happens, the $78 per ton gap between India's carbon price and the EU ETS, that's really the money left on the table. We're losing out on that.
absolutely. And second question is, I'm a tier two, tier three supplier. I think my products go to the large Indian exporter who ships to the EU. Does CBM affect me? The answer is absolutely yes, because the CBM tracks embedded emissions across the value chain. So even if you are a tier three, tier one exporter, you need emission data from your entire supply chain. That includes you, your tier
Mm.
one, tier two supplier, everyone. So if you can't provide it, they either use default values that inflate their cost, or they replace you with a supplier who can provide the verified data. Supply chain traceability is becoming a qualification requirement. Period.
Absolutely. The third question that I see is, how much does this actually cost to implement for a small operation like me? Okay, so there's been some study, the CEEW's research. They acknowledge that MRV and verification costs could be a real barrier for MSMEs, for SMBs. But then if you really do the math, if you are, let's say, exporting 5,000 tons of steel to the EU, and using default values that exist today versus the actual verified values that you'll come up with, the CBAM cost difference could easily be about 100,000 to 200,000 or 1 lakh to 2 lakh euros per year, right? And now a comprehensive MRV system in this case with annual verification mechanisms that might cost you somewhere between 20,000 to 50,000 euros. So compared to the 100,000 to 200,000 cost difference that you will need to bear, this investment of 20 to 50,000 is a clear ROI positive investment, right? This it will pay for itself many times over. Uh,
Yep.
that's just a high level calculation though, but I'm pretty sure when you apply that to your own cost books, it's going to show positive ROI in a short time frame.
100%. All right. So closing costs, closing call. Like let's bring this to home. If you're an Indian SMB is exporting to Europe, here is your 5 point takeaway. This is not an optional. It's not gonna going away. CBM is now live, and FTA does not exempt you. Second, your data is your competitive weapon. Verified actual emission will cost you a fraction of default values. Third, the clock is ticking right now on our verifier availability. Book now their time or risk being stuck with default penalties. The fourth one is decarbonization is no longer just a sustainability initiative. It is a direct financial return on your reduced CBM exposure. And the last one is this is a market share opportunity for firms that move fast, move first
Yeah,
and
yeah.
fast. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you want to go deeper on that, we have our carbon border tax survival playbook that walks through every element that we discussed today. The carbon smart framework, the sector by sector impact analysis, the 30, 60, 90-day action plan that you can adopt, the risk mitigation strategies, all of it. It's all in that playbook, whichever section, whichever area you want to deep dive on, just reach out to us. It's specifically designed for Indian SMBs who are trying to navigate this whole stuff. So let's talk about that. Um,
Yeah.
only.
And yeah, I think CVM clock does not pause for laggards. So if think about like from a winning standpoint, uh, building your competitive advantage. If you want to win this race, you are already separating from the loser. So question is when you take the action and which side of the divide you will be on. With that being said, yeah,
Yeah.
let's conclude today's session. What do you think, Shantanu?
Yes, yes, let's do that. I think it has been quite an interesting one again on this particular topic. Uh, as we said, thank you for joining in today and listening to this. But we would like it even more if we are engaging in more conversations around this. Do share your insights, do share your comments with us, and if you find it useful, share it with others as well. Aniket will be posting this material
Yeah.
on LinkedIn. I'll be posting the videos on LinkedIn too. So let us know what you want to hear from us next, and we are looking forward to come back with a lot more information, a lot more research and insights around this topic going forward. And we'd like to hear from you too. Yes, thank you for today. Look forward to meeting you next time.
Thank you all. See you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Good day.